At 1 AM on the 28th of March 1942, under a hail of enemy fire, an explosive-filled British destroyer slammed into a dock gate in the German-held port of Saint-Nazaire. Within moments, elite commandos were pouring ashore to destroy enemy emplacements and deny the mighty Tirpitz her last place of refuge. That fight, caught on film in real time by German combat cameramen on the ground, captured these iconic shots as enemy soldiers scoured the port in the moments after the battle, unaware that one final explosive act was about to unfold. The global picture for the Allies in early 1942 was decidedly bleak. The Germans were triumphant across much of Europe, the Japanese had invaded Southeast Asia, and Singapore had fallen in February. The Americans had only just joined the fight, and it would take several years before the Allies were fully capable of taking to the offensive in Europe. Despite that global picture, there was still a real desire in Britain to take the fight to the enemy. But how? With U-boats menacing the Atlantic and tying up much of the Royal Navy, the bulk of Britain's regular army forces fighting in North Africa, and the RAF still too small to launch a major bomber offensive, only one option remained: raiding. Enter Combined Operations, a highly skilled force led by the controversial Lord Louis Mountbatten. It was made up of the most daring of men. Commandos and specialist naval, air force and army personnel, all with the express purpose of launching raids along the Atlantic coast, tying up large numbers of German troops across Western Europe and boosting Allied morale. Throughout 1941, 8 small tip-and-run raids had taken place, but as 1942 dawned, the Allies were about to raise the stakes. The first problem though was finding suitable targets. After much consideration, including Norway and the Mediterranean, it was decided that the coast of France was the most suitable place to strike. On that seaboard were several major targets: Bayonne, Dieppe, Alderney and Saint-Nazaire. Ultimately, it was this last target that was chosen. But why? Because of this: the gargantuan German battleship Tirpitz, weighing 42,000 tons and armed with 8 15-inch guns. There was a very real fear of the damage the Tirpitz could do were she to leave her berth in Norway and wreak havoc amongst the Atlantic convoys. Thus far, Tirpitz had proved unbreakable, but she did have one major weakness: her size. She was so big that there was only one dry dock on the Atlantic coast that could service and repair her. It was to be found right here, Saint-Nazaire. Put that dock out of action, and the only sally out the Tirpitz could make would in effect be a suicide mission. Let's wind the clock back to World War II with a fascinating aerial image and take a look at the port as it was in 1942. Saint-Nazaire itself sits on the northern side of the River Loire, right here on the Atlantic coast. The entrance to the port from the open sea was through a single deep water channel, which at the time was studded with coastal defences of all calibers. The dock area consisted of a forward port, the Avant port, open to the south directly from the Loire, and 2 basins. The southernmost of these, the Saint-Nazaire basin, was, and still is, the site of a set of enormous submarine pens, from which German wolf packs were menacing the Atlantic convoys. On the landward side of the Avant port, linked by a single bridge, lay the old town of Saint-Nazaire, a closely built rabbit warren of small workers' houses crammed together next to the docks. Extending out from the southern edge of the port was the old mole and lighthouse, used to help ships navigate the surrounding shallow waters. The entire dock area was substantial and covered with pillboxes, anti-air and coastal gun emplacements, as this wartime film of the port shows. For large vessels like the Tirpitz, there was this structure, the Normandie dock. At 1,150 feet long, the length of 3 football pitches, it was the largest dry dock of its kind in the world at the time. Enclosed at either end by 2 massive rolling dock gates known as caissons, each weighing over 1,000 tons, they would be closed by electric motor before the dock would be emptied by the huge underground pumping station based here. Both the caisson and the pumping station would be key targets for any Allied attack. But how best to do it? Aerial bombing was nowhere near precise enough in 1942, and so was ruled out. Inland attack was out of the question too, as was a pitched naval bombardment, so it was decided a lightning commando raid had the best chance of success. This would take two forms. One, a commando landing in and around the port to silence enemy positions, destroy vessels, bridges, lock gates and pumping stations, and secondly this, the HMS Campbelltown. An outdated First World War era American-built destroyer, she wasn't much to look at, but her role was crucial. It was decided that her mission would be sacrificial. By disguising her as a German destroyer, packing her bows with more than 3 tons of ammonite explosive on a timed fuse, running the gauntlet of German defences and ramming her at full speed into the Normandie dock gate, it was hoped that the resulting explosion would put the dock out of action for good. It was a very bold plan. Campbelltown herself would be under command of this man, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Sam Beattie, a 33-year-old Welsh-born clergyman's son. He joined the Navy in 1927 and was by 1942 an experienced destroyer captain and highly regarded amongst his peers. Also joining the Campbelltown were a mixed medley of shallow draft, fast raiding boats, including 12 Fairmile Bs, a wooden-hulled vessel carrying 15 men and armed with twin Lewis machine guns and a single rapid-firing 20mm Oerlikon. They packed a punch but were very vulnerable to enemy fire. These, along with 2 specialist command vessels, MTB-74 and MGB-314, and 4 torpedo-carrying Fairmile Ds, would transport, along with Campbelltown herself, the commando raiding parties to Saint-Nazaire. The plan, now known as Operation Chariot, and under the command of 34-year-old Commander Robert Ryder, was something like this. The entire force would move in towards Saint-Nazaire in 2 columns, with Campbelltown in the centre. Gaining speed all the time, the left-hand column, known as Group 1, would move into shore, engaging the enemy coastal defences at point-blank range, silencing them before landing their commandos here at the Old Mole, thus securing the vital extraction point for the entire force. The right-hand column, Group 2, would advance a little further with the Campbelltown before veering away and coming ashore here by the old entrance to the port. From this point, the commanders aboard would advance into the complex and take out key targets before heading to the Old Mole for extraction. That left just the Campbelltown. By now alone, and hopefully afloat, she would run at full speed directly into the Normandie dock gate, disembarking her own group of 79 commandos whose role was to silence 2 nearby anti-aircraft guns and destroy the vital pumping house, likewise withdrawing to the Old Mole before the entire group re-embarked for home just 90 minutes later, about the same time that the hidden explosive charges on the Campbelltown were set to blow, destroying the dock for good. And so, it was at 8 PM on the 27th of March 1942, 19 vessels holding 621 sailors and commandos, having departed that morning from Falmouth, arrived here, some 65 miles from the Loire estuary, and headed for the coast. Aided by a bank of fog which had reduced visibility to just 2 miles, they made good progress for 2 hours until they met the submarine HMS Sturgeon, who signalled them towards their target, a voice calling out goodbye and good luck as they passed in the night. Also in Saint-Nazaire that night were a German Army combat camera team. Having travelled to the area the day before, they'd captured images of the nearby U-boat pens for a propaganda film. They weren't to know it, but in the coming hours they would witness something far more dramatic. By 10:30, the force had adopted its final battle formation and increased speed to 15 knots. Following a line of markers left by HMS Sturgeon, the leading vessel passed the last one at 1:02 AM, only 1.5 miles from the port. So far, their luck held. About the same time, a group of 40 RAF Whitley bombers had been overflying Saint-Nazaire, intermittently dropping bombs to keep the defenders looking skywards rather than seawards. But by the time the flotilla had approached, the bombing had stopped, though the planes remained, likely increasing the state of alert of German forces in the area. It was from this very position at 1:22 AM that a single searchlight swept through the thinning fog and illuminated the approaching flotilla, fixing on the disguised Campbelltown as she steamed towards the port. Within moments, all searchlights were fixed on the columns, bathing the area in light, but still no shooting. All that changed at 1:28 AM when, deciding that the approaching force was indeed hostile, all hell broke loose from the northern shore of the Loire. German-born SOE operative Peter Nagel recalled the sight.
The tracer bullets crossed over one another, forming a giant firework display. The enemy anti-aircraft guns installed on the roofs fired down upon us at point-blank range. My gunner, Private Francis Kelly, fired without stopping at the enemy searchlights that were sweeping the waters of the port. The firing was so intense that nobody knew exactly what was going on. Several of our launchers were hit, and as they were made only of wood and filled to the brim with petrol, they exploded.
Almost immediately, enemy attention zeroed in on the Campbelltown, who returned fire with everything she had.
Her 8 Oerlikons pouring out streams of orange tracer shells towards the docks, which crisscrossed with the green enemy fire. She was surrounded by shell splashes. Her own gun flashes and the glare of shells bursting aboard her lit her upper works vividly. Tracer shots ricocheted off her, sailing up into the air in all directions.
As the left-hand column of Group 1 began their own turn towards the withering fire coming from the Old Mole, the Campbelltown pushed on. The fire was ceaseless, wounding more than 3/4 of the men still on her deck. Stuart Chant, on board the Campbelltown, recalled the scene.
Then there was another explosion, and a large report rather like the noise of someone banging a steel door with a sledgehammer. It was caused by a shell, which burst alongside me, and as I lay there dazed and deafened, I wondered what had happened to me. Then suddenly I realised that Sergeant Di Davies of No. 3 Commando, lying just ahead of me, had been hit. For his immediate reaction was to try and struggle to his feet, but I kept him still by wrapping my legs round his shoulders. It was then that I realised that my left leg was wet and sticky and my right arm was spurting blood down into my hand. I, too, had been hit, but by some twist of fate there was no pain, just discomfort.
Advancing now into a blinding light, Beatty caught a glimpse of his target and ordered full speed ahead as the Campbelltown, pouring smoke, pushed on. Just seconds later, at a speed of 19 knots, she slammed into the Normandie Dock's seaward caisson, ripping her bow back like a tin can and burying her some 36 feet into the target. Lieutenant Corin Purdon described the moment.
A shell, glowing red, passed through the wardroom as we sat there, but continued out without exploding. The intensity of noise increased as Campbelltown neared the dry dock. Then came a bump as we hit and passed through the boom, followed by a long, shuddering impact as we struck the gate. We had arrived.
About the same time that the surviving commandos on Campbelltown jumped clear and rushed to silence the nearby guns and for their targets at the pump house, the smaller craft of Group 1 at the Old Mole was suffering badly. In wooden-hulled vessels with external fuel tanks, craft after craft was hit as they tried to land their men, with several bursting into flame. Ralph Batterson was one such man attempting the impossible.
Coming astern into our line of approach as we neared the jetty was a blazing motor launch. Flames blasted skywards and I heard the crackle of burning mahogany from her decks. Worse still, I could smell the pungent reek of petrol, which poured from the damaged extra fuel tank, spilling into the water. The launch drifted in a mass of flames and came to rest at the wall of the jetty, blocking us from our landing point. Lieutenant Henderson moved us clear and aimed for another part of the jetty further on. To our horror, a second motor launch appeared, drifting like a heating fireball on the far side of ML306. We were in danger of being trapped between the two blazing wrecks. As if this were not enough, the petrol tank of the second launch had exploded, and the flames were actually spreading into the water around us. The force of the heat on our faces and bodies was almost unbearable. Bodies floated in this watery bed of fire, horribly mutilated by the explosions or the flames. I saw men burn alive in the petrol that covered the surface, while others sank in bloody foam as they succumbed to their wounds. With the screams of the dying ringing above the noise of the gunfire and the fierce glare of the flames lighting up the harbour, it was a scene from the worst of nightmares. What made it different was that we ourselves were inside the nightmare, and in imminent danger of being set on fire by the blazing launches on either side.
Despite valiant attempts, the devastation wrought by German 20mm guns firing at point-blank range was simply too much. Every vessel attempting to land at the Old Mole was either burned, sunk, or driven away, all with considerable loss of life. The raiders' escape route was destined to remain in German hands. The men of Group 2 had fared only a little better. Also under heavy fire, several groups had managed to get ashore and approach their own targets around the port, unaware that there was now no way home. Beyond them, the commandos who had been aboard the Campbelltown had by now found the pump house and descended by torchlight underground to find their targets. Under the command of Stuart Chant, the party placed 40-pound charges on the pump impellers, initiated their fuses and raced for the surface, the last man reaching safety just moments before a deafening explosion utterly wrecked the pump house. With their job complete, Chant and his men, along with the various parties of Group 2, began to withdraw along this very roadway towards the Old Mole. Visiting this site today is an incredible experience, and you can really imagine the action as you walk the port, which is largely unchanged. In fact, for those of you wanting to make a visit, check out our upcoming on-the-ground tour with classic battlefield tours. More info at the end of the video. So having literally run the gauntlet along this road, the situation soon became clear. Major Bill Copland described his view of the Old Mole.
Close into the mole, the shells of nearby burnt-out MLs still glowed red on the river, whilst in the night behind them, and seemingly suspended in mid-air, blazed a sea of burning petrol through which came shells and tracer fire of all kinds, some of the shells exploding with a rather futile little crack in the air just ahead of us.
The commandos were now faced with a desperate last stand. Their ammunition, limited to what they could carry, wouldn't last long. Their only chance for safety lay across this bridge leading to Saint-Nazaire Old Town and the open countryside beyond. With the enemy on three sides, they flung themselves at the bridge, showering the area with Thompson machine gun fire and grenades as they forced their way across. Fighting would rage for several more hours in the streets and houses of Saint-Nazaire, before eventually, bloodied, exhausted, and out of ammunition, almost all would fall into enemy hands. The moment captured in these powerful scenes filmed by German cameramen on the ground. Back out in the Loire, the picture was equally desperate, as the few remaining motor launches limped out to sea towards their waiting destroyer escorts. The much diminished flotilla, now full of wounded, turned for home at around 7:30 AM, reaching Falmouth the following day. One final vessel was not to make it home, ML 306. Having miraculously survived the onslaught at the port, her crew had nursed the badly damaged craft out to sea, only to run directly into the path of a much larger German corvette, the Jaguar, at 5:30 AM. Towering over the motor launch and calling out for her crew to surrender, she was met with fire from every available gun on ML 306 in response. The German retaliation was swift and brutal. Her much more powerful armament tore into the boat, killing or wounding almost every man. Conspicuous amongst those defenders was Sergeant Tom Durant, who, having emptied his own Bren gun, ran to the vacant twin Lewis gun position, firing non-stop into the enemy vessel until he too fell dead at his post, his body riddled with bullets. Back on shore the following morning, the port began swarming with German troops, including that news team, capturing these haunting shots of the wounded raiders. One image showing No. 2 Commandos Tom McCormick, who would succumb to his wounds within a fortnight. This German newsreel showing that aftermath gives a great overview of the Nazi propaganda at the time, with the narrated line,
"This senseless operation from the English on Saint-Nazaire brought only heavy enemy losses and no success at all."
Well, at that time it was partly true, but as these German souvenir hunters were soon to find out, there was still one more sting in the tail. At 11:45 AM, moments after these shots were taken, the entire port was rocked by an enormous explosion as the Campbelltown, 5 hours later than planned, exploded, throwing the shattered hull into the dry dock and smashing the case onto pieces. But at what cost? Of the 621 men who left Falmouth on Operation Chariot, 382 or 62% became casualties, with 169 making the ultimate sacrifice. Many of those men today lie within a few miles of where they fell, here at Escoublac-la-Balle, Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. Amongst them is Sergeant Tom Durant, awarded the Victoria Cross on the word of an enemy officer, the captain of the Jaguar, who so admired his bravery. The success of Operation Chariot has long been debated, and no doubt it will continue. The Normandie dock was destroyed and remained inoperable for the rest of the war. The Tirpitz didn't sail, and the raid did shake enemy morale, but at enormous cost. There was certainly credit given at home too, with Beatty, the commander of Campbelltown, and 4 other men earning the Victoria Cross for their part in the operation. Perhaps though, the real achievement of Operation Chariot is not found in the result of the raid, but in the message it sent. The charioteers showed that as long as Europe remained under Nazi control, there were men willing to fight and die for its liberty. That brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you, like us, would like to visit these incredible sites and walk in the footsteps of commandos during the Second World War, why not join me live on the battlefields this coming May, where I'll be leading an in-depth tour to France over 4 days, exploring Operation Chariot, the Normandy battlefields, the infamous Dieppe raid and Operation Biting, the combined operations raid on Bruneval radar station, to name just a few. For all of us who love history, there really is no more powerful way to understand the ground than to visit the battlefields. Be sure to check out our friends at Classic Battlefield Tours for the itinerary and a whole range of other upcoming tours around Europe's most iconic battlefields. And we want to finish with a final thank you to WW Buildings, who provided the excellent 3D model used in this film. Check them out at wowbuildings.net. That's all this time. See you again soon.